Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching his year's Pompey by Historia Civilis. So I'm actually quite excited to get into this one because in recent Historia Civilis videos we've basically been following Caesar both politically and militarily. We've been seeing his what he gets up to politically in Rome and his military exploits in Gaul. And in that journey, Pompey is a pretty important side character. We've seen him working in cooperation with Caesar and Crassus in the form of the First Triumvirate to secure both of their political fortunes. And then later on, we will see Pompey fighting against Caesar for control of the empire. Of course, we've got a while to go until that point. That's basically what I know of Pompey. I know that he would go on to fight against Caesar, and that at this point he's collaborating with Caesar, and he is a well-respected general in Rome, and he has a lot of political clout, as we've seen so far. So let's get into more about the man himself and jump into this reaction. '56 BC.
When we last left the city of Rome, it was falling headlong into anarchy.
Yes.
The radical Senator Clodius had transformed himself into a man of the people, and through the use of street gangs, had disrupted public life in the city.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. What we've been seeing in the last couple videos is basically the destruction of many of Rome's republican norms. You know, Rome was a republic, it had certain norms and rules, and we've been seeing those getting thrown out the window. As a culture of political violence springs up. Now, this change had already been happening before Clodius, but he really ramped it up to 100. He was sort of a master at using political violence, in particular mob violence, to get what he wanted politically. And of course, his opponents respond to mob violence with more mob violence, and so the whole thing escalates, and now Rome is kind of becoming a place where there is a culture of political violence, and that is not a great place to be politically. America might want to take some notes. We're not heading in a great direction in that regard, but we're actively seeing that process with Rome. It's descending into a lot of violence.
Another senator, a conservative named Milo, had responded by raising street gangs of his own. Public life had slowly returned to normal, but at the cost of violence on the streets and political uncertainty. Milo, the conservative, looked to the courts to bring an end to the violence. He brought a case against Clodius, accusing him of inciting violence. Everybody knew that Clodius was guilty, but he was able to bribe and threaten his way to a not guilty verdict.
Oh, yeah. How about that? You're being brought to trial, accused of inciting violence, and you use your violence and intimidation tactics along with bribes to get a not guilty verdict. It is, horrifyingly ironic. Not as you can see, not a good situation that Rome is in 56 BC.
As a big old middle finger to Milo, Clodius then brought an identical case against him. Everybody knew that Milo was guilty too, but that didn't stop the Senate from running to his defense. At the trial, as Pompey was speaking on Milo's behalf, Clodius turned to his supporters in the crowd, and together they drowned out Pompey with an obnoxious chant.
Wow.
Clodius would shout, "Who's starving the people to death?" And the crowd would answer, "Pompey." They were referencing the fact that Pompey had been put in charge of Rome's grain supply. Then Clodius would shout, "Who wants to campaign in the east?" And the crowd would answer, "Pompey." There were rumblings that the Senate was going to pick somebody to lead an army to Egypt, and Pompey was definitely interested in the job, so that one was true. Then Clodius would shout, "Who should go instead?" And the crowd would answer, "Crassus." Crassus? Pompey's ally? What did
Okay, so I remember a few videos ago, I think, we saw that the issue of Clodius was kind of driving the triumvirate apart a little bit. Now, supposedly, Clodius was a reformer, and Caesar was the main reformer of the triumvirate, but they leaned towards reform politics, mainly because of Caesar. So Clodius should have been good for them, but he was sort of, splitting them a little bit. He was causing the foundations of the triumvirate to shake.
They have to do with this. There had always been unsubstantiated rumors that Crassus was secretly funding Clodius's street violence.
Right.
And this seemed to confirm that there was some sort of arrangement between the two men. The chants soon died away, and Clodius's supporters changed tactics, spitting at Pompey. Before too long, this caused a fight, mostly because it's bad manners. In the struggle that followed, Pompey was pulled down off the speaking platform. He escaped injured. The trial was called off. After the brawl, Crassus started to make a series of public speeches, arguing that the Senate should put him, and not Pompey, in charge of the yet-to-be-formalized expedition to the east.
Okay, this is interesting. Crassus is really putting himself out there. And this is really not good for the triumvirate, because the whole policy of the triumvirate was that they would act unanimously. So even though Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, these three men disagreed on many things, I'm sure, publicly they would act together. And that's what made it so strong, is that, these three men had a lot of power. Pompey was a well-respected general. He had a lot of respect and political clout. Crassus was just super rich. He had money. That's what he had. Caesar was sort of a rising political star. He was very talented, and he had a lot of popularity among the people. And so these three together, if they acted in uniform, were powerful. And that's what they'd done, more or less, up until this point. But now we're seeing Crassus is trying to take this job that Pompey wants. This is sort of a public disagreement between the two, which is not at all beneficial for the survival of the triumvirate.
Pompey's worst fears were confirmed. The two men were coordinating. This was dangerous. Pompey privately confessed to Cicero that he feared that Crassus would send assassins after him. When it was time for candidates to declare themselves for next year's consulship, the conservatives put forward Cato's brother-in-law, a man named Domitus. If elected, he pledged to recall Caesar from Gaul and take over his command. It was in this context that Caesar summoned Pompey and Crassus to come and meet with him at what we now call the Conference of Luca.
Right.
Pompey and Crassus were at each other's throats, and Caesar's command was in jeopardy. The secret alliance between these three men, the triumvirate, was splintering. Caesar's political survival depended on Domitus going down in defeat. This is when Caesar suggested that Pompey and Crassus should run against Dominus on a joint ticket. If they won, Pompey and Crassus would have the power to extend Caesar's governorship and secure prestigious governorships for themselves. The three men agreed. As we know, Pompey would get Spain and Crassus would get Syria. The two men returned to Rome, with their alliance renewed. Around this time, Caesar sent a message to Clodius to negotiate a side deal. If Clodius would agree to throw his support behind Pompey and Crassus this year, the triumvirate would agree to support his older brother's bid for consul next year. Clodius agreed. This was an ingenious bit of politicking on Caesar's part. It was spring now, and the elections were scheduled for the summer. Pompey and Crassus immediately declared their candidacies and started campaigning. But they needed more time.
Yeah, it's really interesting to what extent Caesar's behind a lot of this. I'm not necessarily sure if he was like the mastermind of the first triumvirate, but he certainly was behind a lot of the decisions. And it seems like he was often the one bringing people together, really getting out there and getting stuff done, on his own initiative. Caesar was a brilliant man. Just on his talents alone. I'm not talking about the morality of anything he did, but he was clearly a very skilled guy in many different ways. But we can see here his political intelligence, and we've seen that throughout the series, not only in gaining support from the masses, which he did very well, but also in terms of his political maneuvers, making alliances and dealing with people behind the scenes. He was clearly very skilled at that as well.
So Clodius summoned his street gangs and did everything he could to disrupt public business. It worked, and the elections were postponed for the sake of public safety. But Clodius's tactics didn't make him any friends. At one point, when the Senate was scheduled to meet, a bunch of his fellow senators physically blocked Clodius from entering the building. Clodius promised that if they didn't let him in, he'd have the Senate house burned down. Yikes. Summer turned to autumn, and then...
Yeah, so just once again, we're seeing some really bad precedents set. Clodius is able to use political violence to directly affect the election, get it pushed back, which, if Caesar's plan works, will directly affect the outcome of the election. So we have a direct link between the political violence and the outcome of an election. Really bad situation. And then you have, a legitimate political official, Clodius, being blocked from entering the legislature, and then he threatens violence in order to get in. It's just all, really a bad situation for a Republican government to be in.
Winter, and still no elections. When the snows came in Gaul, Caesar allowed his men to travel to Rome as private citizens to vote. And so, late in the year, thousands of off-duty soldiers showed up in the city. And then, coincidentally, the street violence stopped. Elections were scheduled for January. On the last day of the year, Rome's 2 consuls stepped down, and there was nobody there to replace them.
55
On the
B.C.
day of the election, before dawn, a group of conservatives, led by Cato and Domitus, their candidate for consul, showed up at the voting grounds. They wanted to be there early to make sure that there was no funny business. But there was funny business. A bunch of Pompey and Crassus's supporters were already there, armed. They attacked the conservatives, killing some and driving the rest away.
Yeah, this is a bad way to start off election day, huh? And, of course there was funny business. I mean, it's particularly bad at the moment, but it's Roman politics. There was always some sort of funny business going on. Though, this level of direct violence and intimidation is sort of a step above what we usually see. Typically we see a lot of bribing in Roman politics. It was sort of, just what people did. Bribes were going, to everyone always. But, this level of violence and coercion and intimidation, this is pretty unusual, even in Rome, where, a lot of shady business does happen.
Apparently, Cato was wounded while defending Domitus. After the sun rose, Caesar's soldiers and Clodius's gang members came forward to cast their votes. Pompey and Crassus won their elections easily, surprising nobody. Since this election was taking place in January, the 2 men assumed office immediately. When elections happened, they were supposed to be overseen by consuls. This led to this weird scenario, where Pompey and Crassus were immediately responsible for overseeing the election that they had just participated in. The elections for Praetor happened next, and this year Cato was a candidate. As Cato was in the process of winning his election, Pompey arbitrarily dissolved the assembly, citing bad omens. Then, after his armed thugs made their rounds, he started up the voting again. This time, weirdly, a bunch of people switched their votes, and Cato did not win. It was obvious to everybody what Pompey had done, and many in the crowd were upset.
Yeah, and the thing is, the meddling with the election here, it's crazy enough to meddle with the election, but honestly, the craziest part about this is how transparent it was. Pompey wasn't even hiding what he was doing. It must have been extremely obvious to everybody there. And at that point, I'm sure a lot of people felt like this whole thing was just a total sham. This election, there's no legitimacy to it at all. which I think was probably becoming true for a lot of Roman institutions and politics with all the violence and intimidation. And this is the issue with that, is that, your institutions start to become illegitimate if they're so influenced by, just blatant coercion. And then people start losing faith in your institutions. And, we're sort of seeing that process gradually occur with Rome.
Then they elected the aediles. Pompey began picking and choosing which elections were valid and which were not. Coincidentally, his allies got in, and everybody else had their results thrown out.
Of course.
This was too much for people to handle. Pompey had gone mad with power. There was some pushing and shoving in the election pens. Both factions had secretly brought weapons, and things got deadly pretty quickly. At the end of the day, Pompey returned home victorious, but covered in blood.
Jesus.
When his pregnant wife saw him, she fainted and would later have a miscarriage.
Wow.
His wife...
I wonder if that's actually true. That kind of seems like one of those stories that's been made up to sort of, it's very storybook way of telling things. He returned from his election victorious but covered in blood, and as a result his wife fainted and would have a miscarriage. This terrible event happens because of your misdeeds. I mean, that sort of stuff was pretty prominent in Roman history. A lot of lying and, fictionalizing and just inventing stuff. So I wonder if that event really occurred with him coming home and her fainting. But regardless, I think the visual of Pompey returning home, victorious but covered in blood, pretty much describes what just happened. He won the election. He got what he wanted. He put a bunch of his men into power, but he's really, lost a lot, I think, to do it. Probably lost a lot of legitimacy among the people, caused a lot of violence, basically set up this sham series of elections. It's really not a good situation.
Wife, by the way, was Caesar's daughter, Julia. The marriage had been arranged years earlier to cement Caesar and Pompey's alliance through the triumvirate.
Yeah.
Once the dust had settled, Pompey and Crassus had an ally in the Senate introduce legislation giving 5-year governorships to Pompey and Crassus, and a 5-year extension to Caesar. As agreed, Pompey would get Spain, Crassus would get Syria, and Caesar would stay in Gaul. But these weren't normal governorships. The legislation also gave the governors authority to unilaterally declare war without consulting the Senate.
Jeez.
This ruffled a lot of feathers, but eventually the legislation passed.
Once again, the Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, although in this case Pompey and Crassus, Caesar's not actually there. I'm not sure if he would have been more discreet if he was, but at least Pompey and Crassus have just decided to forego, hiding at all what they're doing, and are just doing everything completely transparently. It's, clearly, they're setting themselves up for positions, increasing their own power. It's all very self-serving, and it's transparently self-serving.
And their obligation to the triumvirate was fulfilled. And then our sources get a little patchy. But in the fall, we know that the elections were held for the year 54 B.C.E. Pompey and Crassus supported Clodius's older brother for consul, just as they had promised.
Yep.
He won his election, but so did Domitus, Cato's conservative brother-in-law that ran last year. In the winter, Crassus departed for Syria. He would not return, but we'll get to that another day. Pompey decided to ignore his previous agreement with Caesar and Crassus and stay in Rome instead of going to Spain. His reasoning was this: let Crassus win victories in Syria. Let Caesar win victories in Gaul. Pompey's military career was already unparalleled. They called him the next Alexander the Great. He had nothing left to prove. He would stay in Rome, free from Caesar and Crassus's influence, and establish himself as the most powerful man in the city. His subordinates would govern Spain in his absence.
Okay.
Ended the year.
So, seems like Pompey kind of wants to strike out on his own. You know, he doesn't want to be reliant on these other two men, Caesar and Crassus. You know, he would rather establish his own power base, which, I mean, I'm not sure how well it's going to go. It's not necessarily a bad idea if you want to set yourself up in that position. You know, he's already got a storied and respected military career. Now he needs political clout. He's already got a lot of political clout, but I suppose he really wants to make himself the arbiter of Roman politics. I mean, from what we've seen in this video, he seems a little power hungry already. And, you know, I'm not sure how well this is going to go, because people were already a little upset with his actions. But he does have a lot of influence, so I'm not sure exactly how successful he's going to be.
By throwing expensive public games. Apparently the big draw was elephant versus elephant fights, which people seemed to like.
Of course.
The games went over pretty well, and Pompey's popularity began to rise.
And this is another classic element of Roman and Byzantine, but I mean, same, you know, thing. Roman politics, you know, the whole idea of bread and circuses. Pompey's putting on the circus part of that. You know, he's putting on shows. The public, you know, throughout Roman history, the public seems to absolutely love shows like these. You put on a bunch of parties and shows, and you get people on your side. You know, I guess if someone set up a bunch of parties with free food and big events, I'd like that too. And so, you know, Pompey's sort of playing on that. He's using his funds and his influence to throw these events and gain popularity. 54 BCE.
And then, in 54 BCE, his wife unexpectedly died in childbirth.
Uh-oh.
Pompey was genuinely heartbroken and spent a good portion of the year in mourning. Caesar was off campaigning in Britain that summer and wouldn't learn about his daughter's death until he returned to the Gallic coast in the fall. Now, the legal bond between Pompey and Caesar was severed, and the triumvirate was back to being as fragile as ever. When the elections for that year rolled around, there was a massive corruption scandal. All of the candidates for consul were caught bribing the consuls who would be overseeing their election. Last year, Pompey had shown everybody how easy it was to pick winners and losers, and everybody was interested in replicating his success.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised with how things have been going. There's been so much blatant corruption and intimidation that, I mean, to be honest, the bribery doesn't even seem that bad compared to the extremely high levels of coercion and violence we've been seeing.
But fortunately, they were all caught before any of this could happen. Everybody was disqualified, and the election was pushed back 6 months so that new candidates could be found. With violence on the streets and corrupt elections, Romans were feeling like the political system was becoming more and more unstable.
Yeah.
People began to whisper that Pompey should step up and reestablish order. The word dictator started to be thrown around. Before too long...
And by the way, it's worth keeping in mind that dictator was a position in Roman politics. And more importantly, when we use the word dictator today, there's a very negative connotation that comes along with that. You probably wouldn't call someone that you liked a dictator. You know, it doesn't sound good when someone gets accused of being a dictator. In this case, you can remove the negative connotation. You know, people would not have been using it like that. It was a position, you know, to be a dictator. So it's worth keeping in mind that the connotation of the term is very different from then to now.
Brand new candidates were campaigning for consul. One of the candidates was Milo, the conservative senator and leader of half of the city's street gangs. To Clodius, the leader of the other half of the city's street gangs, this was unacceptable. Clodius decided that if Milo was running, there would be no election. He took to the streets, and Rome descended into anarchy. Clodius's gangs and Milo's gangs clashed all over the city. There were deaths every day, and corpses were just left lying openly on the streets. Public
Jesus.
business ground to a halt.
I mean, when you look at this, and keep in mind the wider context, which is that in not so long from now, 54 BC, we are going to see the collapse of the Roman Republic. We'll see Caesar emerge, and then, the dynasty of emperors will begin. So if you keep that in mind and look at this situation, it becomes a lot more understandable why the Republic would end up collapsing. We can basically see its slow decline right here. We're seeing the increase of violence and coercion and intimidation, which, disrupts the business of the city, disrupts people's lives, and importantly, decreases the legitimacy of the system because, pretty much the first thing government's supposed to do, at least in my opinion, is protect its citizens. That is the number one thing. And if your government stops being able to protect you, defend you, that's kind of what we're seeing here. People are getting killed, there's corpses piling up, people can't go about their daily business because of mob violence on the street. If that happens, then people start thinking, you know what, maybe we should have a different government. I mean, we're seeing that with people telling Pompey to step it up, and then, like I said, in a bit, Caesar's going to step it up. So if we think about it like that, it becomes less shocking that the Republic would collapse, because it's becoming unable to perform its basic functions, which is defending people and protecting them.
This continued for months, and the elections kept on being pushed back.
53 BC.
When January 1st rolled around, there had been no elections, which meant that, again, there were no new consuls there to assume office. One day in late January, Milo was leaving Rome on business, and just happened to meet Clodius returning to the city on the same road. Each man was flanked by armed bodyguards. The groups almost passed in peace, but two gladiators working for Milo couldn't keep their mouths shut, and started taunting Clodius's men. Fighting broke out spontaneously. In the confusion, Clodius was hit in the shoulder with a javelin. Clodius's men tried to rush him into a building, but Milo's men overpowered them. Clodius was killed, and his body was just left on the road.
Well, I mean, frankly, seems a fitting end for the man who introduced so much violence to Rome, who really accelerated the process of mob violence and violence in politics. For him to be killed and left at the side of the road, yeah, I mean, it seems fitting. You find success in violence, then, you may die in violence. But I doubt the situation's going to get better. Maybe it will. Maybe it will, actually. I mean, Clodius was one of the main perpetrators of this street violence, so maybe things will cool down with him gone. The cynical side of me thinks maybe not, but I suppose we'll have to see.
Eventually, a traveler recognized Clodius's body and had it sent to Rome. When it got to Rome, news spread of Clodius's death. An angry mob gathered. They took his body and marched toward the Forum. They had intended to hold a funeral in the Forum, but instead, the mob stormed the Senate House.
Yeah, of course. Of course it didn't get better. What am I saying? Yeah. Of course it would only cause more violence and disruption.
They took tables, chairs, benches, and anything else that would burn, and piled it in the center of the Senate chamber. Clodius's body was laid atop the makeshift pyre, and the wood was ignited. In death, Clodius fulfilled his promise. His funeral pyre burned the Senate House down.
Wow.
Rome's senators were horrified by this. Rome had been ungovernable for months, but if an angry mob could burn down the Senate, an angry mob could overthrow the government.
Yeah. Yeah, this is when you start to get really, really worried. Your legislature has been stormed, which in its own, your federal government buildings being stormed is very worrying. Think back on January 6th. That was a very concerning event for America. It's very concerning here. And even worse, they've managed to burn it down. That's kind of a death knell for your republic. I think that's sort of the writing on the wall. Now, you may survive this. I'm not saying if something like this happens to your republic, it can't come back. But, it's a really, really bad sign for the survival of your government. This is true throughout history. If you have government buildings stormed or royal palaces or, whatever we're talking about, and things start getting burned and people are getting executed, you can probably sense that a big change is coming. And that's kind of what it looks like here.
The whispering intensified. Dictator. The people wanted Pompey to restore order. Everybody was now taking the threat of the mob seriously, but the conservatives in the Senate had an understandable aversion to dictators. So they struck a compromise. Pompey would be allowed to rule as sole consul in the year 52. This was super duper illegal. First, there had to be a 10-year gap between consulships. That was the law. Pompey had served only 3 years earlier. Second, there was no election. The Senate just decided that Pompey would be the next consul. Since when was that a thing? But nevertheless, in the year 52 BCE, Pompey assumed power.
I mean, the thing is, yes, this is super illegal, and the Romans were a pretty legalistic bunch. They loved to have their laws and follow their laws, but at this point in politics, every rule in the book has been broken, 100 times over. So I suppose their thinking is that, well, everything's terrible anyhow, and we, this is not legal, and we don't necessarily want to appoint Pompey as sole consul, but it's better than the alternative, which could be the entire collapse of our government. I suppose it's better than... I understand the conservatives' aversion to appointing Pompey as dictator. It's just a bad situation to be in, You're facing, mob violence. The Senate the forum's been burned down. Your government is on extremely shaky foundations. And then the solution you turn to is the creation of a dictator. Neither of these are great options. Let your government fall or appoint a dictator. I'm not sure if there would have been another way out, but it seems like they were pretty desperate at this point. So, it's kind of like, well, we have to do something, and this is what they decided to do. Will it work out? We'll have to see.
When they had their consul in place, Bibulus, maybe you've heard of him, put forward some legislation. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final act. This special piece of legislation gave the consuls, in this case just Pompey, unrestricted power to defend the Republic. It was the Roman equivalent to martial law. The bill passed without much debate.
Yeah, so, you can just see the Republic falling apart as we speak, and it's unfortunate because, this is very typical. We see this throughout history where, a government has a crisis situation, and then in order to combat it, they give the government or the executive or the dictator these extreme powers in violation of law, in violation of civil rights, and sometimes the crisis is solved. Sometimes everything still collapses. Often, the crisis is dealt with somewhat, but the government will retain a lot of those powers that is granted itself. It's just an unfortunate situation. It really is.
Pompey immediately raised an army and had it enter the city. Just
Wow.
like that, Rome was under military occupation. Legionaries patrolled the streets and fought the street gangs whenever they were found. Eventually, with soldiers on every street corner, people began to go about their daily lives again.
And in this case, this is basically the implementation of martial law. And to be honest, with the level of anarchy that was around, I get it. It does seem justified, I think. The Romans probably could use the police force, but in absence, bringing an army in to basically police the city seems to have been one of the few actions that would save the city from the anarchy and violence that was going on. But of course, when we have a crisis situation like this, what I was mentioning, where the government will often keep the powers it grants itself, this is why we just have to be very careful that any crises we try and solve with extra governmental powers are real crises and, deserve the granting of extra powers, and that, we try and make sure that any temporary powers are actually temporary to the best of our abilities. I'm not sure what the long-term ramifications of these actions will be, but, like I'm saying, some sort of order had to be restored in Rome. And so I understand why this action was taken.
As an olive branch, Pompey had Milo arrested for Clodius's murder. Milo was found guilty and was exiled from Rome. The army patrolled the streets for about a month. Peace was restored, and Pompey was the most powerful man in Rome. This is exactly what he wanted. Finally, Pompey had decided that the crisis had passed, and that it was time to relinquish his extra-legal authority. Somewhere in this period, Pompey remarried. He invited his new father-in-law, a leading conservative, to serve with him as consul for the remainder of the year. Again, no election was held. They were just making it up as they went along. Together, Pompey and his father-in-law passed a string of conservative reforms, such as a prohibition on candidates standing for office in absentia. This was an indirect attack on Caesar, of all people.
Yeah, so to some extent, Pompey gave up the powers he was granted, which is very good, but he still used that opportunity to get his father-in-law in as his co-consul, and now he can, pass legislation basically unopposed. So, even if these extra powers are officially rescinded, the effects can linger.
Since it would force him to give up his command early and get dragged into court over his illegal actions during his term as consul.
Yep.
Pompey and Caesar's alliance was broken. The triumvirate was dead.
Wow.
Pompey achieved his dream of becoming the most powerful man in Rome by openly abandoning Caesar's reform faction and transforming himself into the champion of the conservative cause.
Well, we'll see how that turns out for him. Spoiler alert, doesn't turn out well. Pompey doesn't win the wars against Caesar, as we know, because we all remember Caesar a lot more than we remember Pompey. That was an interesting one. It was basically about Pompey's rise to power and him managing to grab power in a crisis situation. Like I said, in the end, Pompey will not come out on top. So a lot of this is basically futile. Caesar will be the victor in this whole situation, but the triumvirate is dead. This has been a pretty important political alliance. Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar working together managed to get a lot done. And now it's done. It's over. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had a good time watching this. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the Patreon, which is linked down below, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I hope to see you guys again next time. I hope you're all having a good day today, and I will see you again soon. Goodbye.